There's a pattern that psychiatrist Carl Jung noticed throughout his decades of clinical work that contradicts everything we think we know about strength. The patients who walked into his office carrying the deepest wounds, the ones who had absorbed the most pain from the world around them, often emerged as the most powerful forces for transformation, not in spite of their breaking, but because of it. Here's what's paradoxical. We live in a culture that treats sensitivity as weakness and emotional breaking as failure. We're told to toughen up, build walls, protect ourselves from feeling too much. But Jung discovered something that challenges this entire framework. The empaths who shattered most completely, who felt the world suffering so intensely they could barely function, possessed a hidden capacity that those who never broke could never access. This isn't a story about resilience. It's about alchemical transformation. And by the end of this exploration, you'll understand why the journey through complete psychological fragmentation creates a kind of strength that cannot be built any other way. A strength that Jung himself called the union of opposites, the integration of shadow, and the birth of the individuated self. But first, we need to understand what actually happens when an empath breaks. Most people think empathy is simply the ability to feel what others feel. That's not quite right. True empaths, the kind Jung worked with, don't just mirror emotions. They absorb the unprocessed psychological material of everyone around them. They become repositories for collective pain, family trauma, and unexpressed suffering that has nowhere else to go. Imagine walking into a room and feeling not just your own anxiety, but the suppressed rage of your father, the unspoken grief of your mother, the ambient terror that 3 generations refuse to acknowledge. That's not metaphor. That's the daily experience of deep empaths. Their nervous systems haven't learned the boundary between self and other. Or perhaps more accurately, their psyches are structured differently from birth. More porous, more receptive, more vulnerable to the invisible currents that most people never detect. Jung called this phenomenon psychological contagion, and he observed it most profoundly in those he termed the wounded healers. These were individuals whose own sensitivity made them lightning rods for collective suffering. They didn't choose this role. It chose them, often in childhood, when their developing psyches were too young to understand what was happening. Here's where it gets interesting. When these empaths are young, they develop what Jung called the persona, an elaborate mask designed to function in the world despite carrying all this absorbed pain. They become the peacemakers, the caregivers, the ones who hold everyone else together. They learn to smile while drowning. They master the art of appearing fine while their internal world fractures under the weight of emotions that don't even belong to them. This can work for years, sometimes decades. But here's the truth that Jung understood. The psyche won't tolerate this split forever. At some point, the gap between the functional persona and the overwhelmed interior becomes too vast. The structure collapses, the empath breaks. And this breaking looks like many things. Depression that makes getting out of bed feel impossible. Anxiety that transforms every social interaction into a minefield. Physical illness that has no clear medical cause. Relationships that implode. Career paths that dissolve. Sometimes it looks like what psychiatry calls a nervous breakdown. Sometimes it looks like what Jung called a spiritual emergency. But here's what most people miss. This breaking isn't random. It's not weakness. It's the psyche's desperate attempt to force a transformation that can't happen any other way. When an empath breaks, they're forced into a confrontation that Jung considered essential for psychological development, but that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. They must face their shadow. Now, the shadow isn't just the parts of ourselves we don't like. It's far more complex than that. The shadow contains everything we've repressed, denied, projected onto others, or refused to integrate. For empaths who have spent years absorbing everyone else's darkness while maintaining a persona of light and service, the shadow is enormous. It contains not just their own rejected aspects, but the collective darkness they've been carrying for others. Jung observed that when this shadow material finally erupts, it feels like annihilation. The empath, who defined themselves by their goodness, their sensitivity, their ability to help others, suddenly encounters rage they didn't know they possessed. Selfishness, cruelty, the desire to hurt those they've been protecting. Profound resentment for years of being used as an emotional dumping ground. This is where most empaths get stuck. They interpret these shadow emotions as proof that they're actually bad people, that all their help was a lie, that they're frauds. But Jung saw it differently. He understood that this encounter with shadow wasn't corruption. It was the beginning of wholeness. Because here's the secret. You cannot be truly strong without integrating your darkness. The empath who only knows light is incomplete. They're fragile. They can be manipulated by anyone who triggers their guilt or their desire to help. But the empath who has descended into their shadow and survived, they've gained something irreplaceable. They've met the full spectrum of human experience within themselves. Jung was fascinated by alchemy, not as literal chemistry, but as a psychological metaphor for transformation. The alchemist talked about breaking down base materials into their fundamental elements through a process called nigredo, the blackening. Only after this complete dissolution could the philosopher's stone be created. This is exactly what happens to broken empaths. The breaking is the nigredo. The persona dissolves. The false self that was built on people-pleasing and emotional absorption disintegrates. Everything they thought they knew about who they are gets liquefied. And in that liquid state, in that psychological chaos, something new becomes possible. Jung identified several key stages in this alchemical process that broken empaths move through, often without realizing what's happening. The first stage is separation. The empath who has spent their life merged with others' emotions finally learns to distinguish what's theirs and what isn't. This sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. For the first time, they can feel anger and ask, is this mine, or am I carrying someone else's unexpressed rage? They can feel sadness and trace its origin. This separation is the beginning of psychological boundaries, but real boundaries, not the walls most people build. The second stage is confrontation with the wound. Every empath has a core wound, usually formed in early childhood, that made them so permeable to others' pain in the first place. Maybe they learned that their value depended on taking care of a parent's emotions. Maybe they absorbed family trauma that predated their birth. Maybe they were never allowed to have their own feelings because someone else's needs always took priority. In the breaking, this original wound finally gets exposed. It's excruciating, but it's also the source code that's been running their entire life. The third stage is what Jung called the transcendent function. This is when the psyche begins to create a third position, a place that can hold both the persona and the shadow, both the wounded child and the emerging authentic self. It's not about choosing one or the other. It's about creating a container large enough for the full paradox of human existence. Now here's where Jung's insights become truly profound. He observed that the empaths who successfully moved through this breaking and integration process emerged with a kind of power that was qualitatively different from anything they possessed before. It wasn't the power of the ego, that aggressive force that dominates and controls. It wasn't the power of the persona, that sophisticated mask that wins approval. It was what Jung called the power of the self with a capital S, the integrated totality of the psyche. These transformed empaths could still feel deeply. Their sensitivity hadn't disappeared. But now it was paired with something it never had before: discernment. They could feel the suffering of others without becoming that suffering. They could offer compassion without sacrificing themselves on the altar of everyone else's needs. They had learned the difference between empathy and enmeshment. Jung noticed 4 key capacities that emerged in these individuated empaths. First, they developed what he called psychological sight. Having navigated their own depths, they could now see the hidden dynamics in any situation. They could identify shadow projections, recognize trauma patterns, sense what wasn't being said. But unlike before, when this awareness just made them absorb more pain, now they could witness it without taking it on. Second, they gained access to what Jung called the collective unconscious from a position of groundedness. They could tap into archetypal patterns, sense the movements of the collective psyche, understand the deeper currents shaping human behavior. But they weren't drowning in it anymore. They'd built an internal structure that could channel these forces without being overwhelmed. Third, they embodied paradox. They were simultaneously vulnerable and unbreakable, soft and fierce, compassionate and boundaried. They'd integrated what Jung called the union of opposites, holding space for both and rather than either or. This made them extremely difficult to manipulate because they couldn't be pulled into false dichotomies. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, they'd transmuted their wound into their gift. The very sensitivity that had caused so much suffering became their greatest instrument for transformation, both their own and others. But now it was wielded with consciousness, with choice, with power. Jung spent considerable time exploring the archetype of the wounded healer, exemplified by Chiron in Greek mythology, the centaur who could heal everyone except himself. But Jung's insight went deeper than the myth. He recognized that the wound isn't just something to overcome, it's the actual source of healing capacity. Think about it this way: the empath who has never broken, who has managed their sensitivity through walls and defenses, can offer sympathy. But they can't offer genuine healing presence. They haven't been to the underworld. They don't know the territory of psychological dissolution. They can't guide others through waters they've never navigated themselves. But the broken empath who has made the journey, they carry a different quality entirely. When they sit with someone else's pain, there's no platitude, no rushing to fix, no discomfort with darkness. They've been shattered. They know what it feels like to be in pieces on the floor. And they also know in their bones that something can be rebuilt from that wreckage, something truer than what existed before. This is why Jung observed that his most effective therapists were often those who had experienced their own psychological crises. The wound wasn't a liability, it was a credential. It provided credibility in the realm of suffering that no amount of academic training could replicate. But here's the crucial distinction. The wounded healer isn't someone stuck in their wound, perpetually bleeding and expecting others to tend to them. That's not healing. That's narcissism wearing the mask of sensitivity. The true wounded healer has done the work Jung described. They've descended into shadow, integrated the opposites, and emerged individuated. Their wound is transformed, not transcended. It becomes a doorway, not a prison. Jung was deeply interested in mystical traditions, particularly the concept of the dark night of the soul described by St. John of the Cross. He recognized that what mystics called spiritual crisis and what psychology called breakdown were often the same process viewed through different lenses. The dark night strips away everything false. For empaths, this means the collapse of the helper identity, the good person persona, the one who always puts others first. When these structures fall away, it feels like death. Because in a very real sense, it is death. The death of who you thought you were. But Jung saw this death as purposeful. The psyche isn't cruel. It's precise. It only destroys what's false to make room for what's true. The breaking happens because the soul is too large for the container that's been built. The old structure must be demolished, so a new architecture can emerge. During his own psychological crisis in his 40s, Jung experienced what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He had visions, heard voices, felt himself fragmenting. By conventional standards, he was having a psychotic break. But Jung approached it differently. He engaged with the images, dialogued with the inner figures, allowed the process to unfold. And from that darkness, his most profound work emerged. The theories of archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, all of it came from his willingness to break and then pay attention to what was happening in that breaking. This is the gift he offered to broken empaths everywhere, the framework to understand their shattering not as pathology, but as initiation. So what does life look like for the empath who has moved through this complete transformation? Jung was careful not to romanticize it. Integration doesn't mean perpetual bliss. It doesn't mean never feeling pain. It means something far more valuable: wholeness. The integrated empath has learned to live what Jung called the symbolic life. They understand that their sensitivity isn't a curse to overcome or a superpower to wield. It's a function, a way of perceiving reality that serves a purpose when used consciously. They've stopped asking, "Why am I like this?" and started asking, "What is this sensitivity trying to show me?" They've also developed what Jung considered the hallmark of psychological maturity, the ability to hold tension, the tension between giving and receiving, between feeling deeply and maintaining boundaries, between serving others and honoring self. These tensions never disappear, but the integrated empath no longer needs to resolve them prematurely. They can live in the creative space between the opposites. Perhaps most significantly, they've stopped performing empathy. The mask is gone. They're no longer the designated emotional processing center for everyone around them. Some people will be disappointed by this. The ones who benefited from the empath's boundaryless giving will resist the change. But the integrated empath has learned something crucial. Disappointing others is sometimes the most compassionate act available. Because here's Jung's ultimate insight. The greatest gift you can give the world isn't your unlimited empathy. It's your individuation. When you become who you actually are, when you integrate your shadow and live from your authentic self, you give permission for others to do the same. You become a force that doesn't just heal individuals, but shifts the collective field. This is why Jung said that the broken empaths who do this work become the strongest forces, not strongest in the sense of dominating or controlling, strongest in the sense of gravitational pull. They become centers of psychological gravity that naturally draw others toward wholeness, not through teaching or preaching, but through embodiment. The empath who has never broken might help many people, but the empath who has shattered, descended into shadow, integrated the opposites, and emerged individuated. They don't just help people, they transform the very field in which healing becomes possible. So let's return to where we began, to that paradox that Jung noticed throughout his work. The most broken empaths become the strongest forces. Now you understand why. It's because breaking isn't the opposite of strength. It's the forge in which true strength is created. The empath who maintains the persona, who keeps the walls up, who never descends into their depths. They might be functional, but they'll never be whole. They'll never access the full spectrum of their power because they've refused half of their experience. But the empath who breaks? They've been given the terrible gift of initiation. They've been forced into the work that Jung considered the central task of human existence, individuation. And if they have the courage to move through the process, rather than just surviving it, they emerge as something new. Not better than others, not more enlightened, just more complete, more integrated, more themselves. And that self, that authentic integrated self, becomes a beacon. It shows others what's possible. It demonstrates that you can feel everything and not be destroyed by it, that you can acknowledge your darkness and not be consumed, that you can be shattered and remade into something stronger, truer, more alive than what you were before. This is Jung's legacy to every broken empath watching this right now. Your breaking isn't your failure, it's your initiation. The question isn't whether you'll heal, it's whether you'll have the courage to transform, to let the old self die, to integrate the shadow, to birth the individuated self that's been waiting in the wreckage all along. The world doesn't need more people performing empathy from behind a mask. It needs empaths who have done the work Jung described, who have been broken and remade, who carry their wounds as wisdom, who understands that the journey through darkness isn't something to avoid. It's the only path to becoming truly, powerfully, undeniably yourself. That's the force Jung recognized. That's the strength that only breaking can forge. And that's the invitation extended to every empath courageous enough to stop running from their shattering and instead ask, what is this breaking trying to birth in me?